Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fries, your host. I'll be with you for the next hour, and we're going to continue where we left off the other day in the book, The Ark the Dove by J. Moss Ives. We were talking about Cecil Calvert and the last Lord Baltimore. This is the end of the Catholic rule in Maryland. The Roman Catholic colony of Maryland under the rule of Cecil Calvert at this particular time during the reading, and we'll pick up where we left off last time. It says, Cecil Calvert had ruled the province for over 40 years, and his son was to rule for only 15 years. Then was to come an end to the rule of Catholic Lords Baron in Maryland. The Protestant Revolution of 1688 brought this about. Apparently, the time was not ripe for making permanent the Baltimore program of religious freedom. It had come ahead of its time. It was so little understood that its overthrow was accomplished very easily. Rumors of popish plots. Now, this is one of the subjects that we talked about Wednesday with Brother John Daniel, author of the book The Grand Design Exposed. This book paints part of the cause of the downfall of the Catholic rule of Maryland as a result of popish plots or rumors of Jesuit problems, which were bantered about in Britain and then transferred to the colonies. But John Daniel says it's because of documented Jesuit wranglings and typical Jesuit activities, attempts of subversion and overthrow the British government. And we'll continue now. It says, rumors of popish plots in the old country, that's Great Britain, always reverberated in the colonies. When Titus Oates became a national hero because of his wild tale of a Catholic plot to assassinate King Charles II and turned the country over to the Jesuits, there was a reaction in Maryland. Oates had been an Anabaptist preacher and then an Anglican clergyman and had been unfrocked by both denominations. Conceiving the idea of informing against the Catholics, he pretended to become a Catholic convert and studied for the priesthood at Valladolid and St. Omer's and was expelled from both institutions. He bore all the earmarks of an impostor. His story, very apparently a pure fabrication, was swallowed at first by that class of Protestants who were over-credulous when it came to stories of Catholic conspiracies and eager to believe they were true. He was finally exposed and punished, but not before 35 innocent people had been judicially murdered. At about the time of the first excitement over the so-called revolutions of Oates and Reverend John Yo came to Maryland, it says, beginning of the Anglican clergy, he thought that a living would be very helpful, for with separation of church and state in the colony, there was no government support for the ministers of the Church of England. So he wrote a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury in which he stated many things which were not true, according to this author, and which he must have known were not true. Because there were only 3 Protestant ministers who conformed to the doctrine of the Church of England in the colony, religion was despised and all notorious vices committed, so that it had become a Sodom of wickedness and a pest house of iniquity. All historians now recognize the falsity of this assertion, yet at the time it carried weight. What Yo was seeking was the establishment of the Church of England, and with that agitation against Catholics, he thought it was a good time to bring it about. Lord Baltimore at once replied that all forms of Christian faith were tolerated and every denomination supported its own clergy, that the Protestant nonconformists outnumbered the Anglicans and Catholics by 3 to 1, and that to compel them to support clergy not of their own faith would be unjust. He showed that there were an adequate number of ministers of the Church of England to take care of the needs of what few Anglicans there were, and that these had been given plantations of their own and were provided for in every way. That in every country there were churches and meeting houses for the Protestants, and he further pointed out the difficulty in the way of inducing different denominations to consent to support of a church other than their own. This appeal, despite its apparent justice, fell on deaf ears. The Bishop of London, without taking the trouble to investigate the facts, reported to the Committee on Plantations that, quote, the deplorable state of Maryland in regard to religion, unquote, was due to ministers of the Church of England being, quote, utterly destitute of support, whereby immorality reigns supreme, unquote. In refutation of the false report of Yo, the prominent and more respectable of the Protestants issued the Declaration of May 13, 1682, professing themselves to be Christians, quote, according to the liturgy of the Church of England, and Protestants against the doctrine and practice of the Church of Rome, unquote. They declared that they possessed, quote, the free and public exercise of the religion, whatsoever it be, unquote, that they enjoyed, quote, in as full and ample manner as in any of His Majesty's subjects in any part of His Majesty's domains, the general freedom and privilege in their lives, liberties and estates according to the grand privileges of the Magna Carta, unquote. They further declared, quote, His Lordship favors are impartially distributed, and places of honor, trust, and profit conferred on the most qualified for the purpose of serving without any regard to religion of the participants, of which general, and for the most part, it hath so happened that the Protestants have been the greatest number, unquote. Here was a complete repudiation of the calumnies of the Reverend Yo, and further evidence of the fact that the freemen of Maryland were ever mindful that the original source of their rights and liberties was the Great Charter of Maryland. When Charles II died and his Catholic son came to the throne as James II, Lord Baltimore had reason to hope that there would be an end to the petty opposition to his rule and policies. But if hope of this kind he had, he was doomed to disappoint. He was doomed to disappointment, Of the four Stuart kings, James II was the least friendly and gave the least support to the proprietary government of Maryland. In this brief reign of 3 years, he did not evince the slightest interest in the cause of religious liberty in the Baltimore colony. James, running true to the traditions of the Stuart dynasty, was opposed to granting political rights and privileges to his subjects anywhere. In the case of Maryland, he was jealous of the Palatine powers of Lord Baltimore, and was determined to curb his independence and bring the colony into line with the other colonies under his direct control and subjection. In order to accomplish this purpose, he was willing to sacrifice the rights of the Catholic proprietary and the comfort and well-being of Catholic colonists. In the last years of Charles II, there was a threat of a writ of quo warranto against the Royal Charter of Maryland due to the pressure of some of the English churchmen and their desire for church establishment. Lord Baltimore, who had been in Maryland since the death of his father, returned to England to defend his rights. He probably would have been successful before the tolerant Charles, but James gave ear to the appeals of the enemies of Baltimore, for they seemed to fit in, for the moment, with his colonial policy. In vain did the Maryland proprietary plead that his administration and that of his father had always been in strict conformity with the Royal Charter, and that there was no just cause for declaration of forfeiture. James gave orders for the writ to be issued, but before this was done, he was thrust from power. Quote, in the whole story of American colonialization, says Cobb, there's nothing more preposterous and absurd than the outcry of lying Protestants in Maryland to a Catholic king and his readiness to listen, unquote. During the absence of Lord Baltimore in England, his enemies in Maryland had been busy. As there were no Catholic plots being imported at the time, and the Titus Oates plot being a bit stale, resort was had to a plot of home manufacture. The old familiar "no popery" cry was raised, and to give support to it, a story was circulated of a plot to kill all Protestants with the aid of hostile Indian tribes. Indian footprints were seen in the snow, and this could only mean that the Catholics and Indians were in a conspiracy, and that there would soon be a St. Bartholomew's Eve in Maryland. Now look, before I continue, the St. Bartholomew's massacre of the French Huguenots was real. 70,000 Protestants died. And fear of a Roman Catholic uprising against Protestants with that history in view is legitimate. And it's because of the history of acts like the St. Bartholomew's Massacre in France, the fear of a Roman Catholic-controlled government in this country is just as legitimate in our day. The fear of a global papal hegemony, a global papal New World Order, in light of what the Bible says about the Roman Catholic Church in the last days. Particularly Revelation 17 makes it more than legitimate to raise concerns about the Roman Catholic Church's influence and power and control of our government. Now, this Roman Catholic author tries to throw up the idea that these fears were unwarranted at the time. But let us not take that example. If it was indeed true, as this author puts it in this book, it's not a guide as to what is normal in the world regarding the Vatican and Catholics in their attempts to gain control of government. It's the trademark of the Jesuit order. And their history is replete with example after example after example. A Jesuit is not a Jesuit if he is not working successfully to raise the papacy to world sovereign status as a world monarch. And that's what the New World Order is. And it says, to get back to the book now, he says, help, too, was to be given by the French in Canada. All that was needed to fan the fire of insurrection was a story of this kind. A story, he calls it. And it says no substantiation was needed to serve the purpose intended. But there was plenty of substantiation, as I just alluded to. Continuing, it says, the story was investigated by some of the Protestants who had signed the previous declaration refuting Yo's yarns, and they declared all this alarm was nothing but, quote, a sleeveless fear, an imagination fomented by the artifice of some ill-minded persons who are studious and ready to take all occasions of raising disturbances for their own private and malicious interest, unquote. This, however, did not have any effect on the troublemakers who were not at all interested in the truth or falsity of the reports. John Coode, who is said to have been both a Catholic and a Protestant, once a clergyman and now an atheist, was the originator of the story of the conspiracy and became the leader of the malcontents of the colony. In 1688, James was forced to flee from England to William and Mary, where and William and Mary were proclaimed the rightful successors to the throne. Immediately, Lord Baltimore, who was in England, sent a messenger to Maryland with an order to the provincial court to proclaim the new sovereigns. The messenger died on the voyage, so while the other colonies were announcing allegiances to the new sovereigns, Maryland was silent. Another messenger was sent, but before he arrived, the damage had been done. Coode was quick to take advantage of the situation. He sent an address to the new Protestant sovereigns extolling his own efforts to have their majesties proclaimed, and proclaimed that Baltimore had failed to cause such proclamation to be made. He asked royal aid for the advancement of the Protestant cause and followed this by organizing a, quote, association in arms for the defense of the Protestant religion and assisting the rights of King William and Queen Mary, unquote. A declaration of the reasons for the armed force was printed and circulated. In this were statements obviously false, but as the words papist and Jesuits were used often and effectively, they received full credence and fanned the fires of religious hatred to such an extent that Coode and his followers were able to oust the Baltimore officials and seize the colonial government. An assembly was called from which Catholics were excluded. To this assembly, the freeholders of Calvert County, headed by Sheriff Taney, refused to send delegates and embodied their reasons in a statement denying the charges of Coode. For this act of independence, Taney was put in jail. The minds of the members of the assembly, according to Cobb, were completely filled with their frantic hatred of Catholics, and they kept dinning the king's ears. They kept, dinning the king's ears with their insane bellowings, unquote. Not only were Catholics imprisoned, but also Protestants who refused to support Coode and denied his charges against Lord Baltimore, the Catholics and the Jesuit missionaries, well knowing they were not true. Now, this is refuted heavily by John Daniel, as he stated Wednesday on the broadcast. It says in 1690, the Attorney General was instructed to proceed against the charter in an action of scire facias. And it says, as this would take time, and as King William was impatient to do something for his Protestant subjects, he appealed to the Chief Justice to know if he could not at once take over the colonial government. The Chief Justice said it would be better to wait until a hearing was held to determine if there were any grounds for a forfeiture of the charter. But if the case was urgent, the king might take over the government and investigate afterwards. So on this questionable advice, King William seized the colony, and in August of 1691, Sir Lionel Copley was made the first royal governor of Maryland. The commissioners of the Privy Seal doubted the legality of the decision and refused to confirm the commission without orders from the council. No legal judgment was ever obtained, as in the subsequent proceedings, the facts alleged and were not to have been proven. The Lords of Trade had recommended that a governor be sent to Maryland who would inquire into the situation of affairs and report. In the meantime, a new commission for Copley was prepared and submitted to Lord Baltimore, who objected on the grounds that it was intended to deprive him of the powers of government which had been bestowed upon him by the charter. The continuance of his territorial right was conceded, and with this, as it was useless for him, a Catholic, to contest the will of the crown, he had to be content. So it was that Copley's commission as governor finally bore the signature of Lord Baltimore. So it was that Copley's commission as governor finally bore the signature of Lord Baltimore. Coode, who was responsible for what happened, received no recognition nor reward. there was some historic justice in this. He dropped out of sight after a while, but afterwards reappeared in holy orders. Nicholson, who succeeded Copley as royal governor, is recorded as beating Coode with his cane for being drunk and creating a disturbance at divine worship. In 1696, charges were made against him that, quote, he did not only cheat his parish, but likewise ran away with 15,000 pounds of tobacco belonging to it, unquote. As he eluded arrest, a reward was offered for his capture. But when he was finally arrested and convicted, the royal governor and the council agreed that, quote, the said Coode was very serviceable to his most sacred majesty and this province upon the said revolution, unquote, and his punishment and fine were suspended. In 1700, he was pardoned in consideration of his, quote, former services, unquote. Yet, according to his own statement, he was actuated in bringing about the revolution by a motive of revenge toward Lord Baltimore. The authorities did not seem to realize that in recognizing the service of this miscreant and acknowledging that he was chiefly responsible for the revolution which placed them in power, they were damning themselves. Copley was a staunch churchman and brought over several clergy to aid him in establishing the Church of England. He summoned an assembly which, after thanking the king and queen for delivering them from the, quote, arbitrary will and pleasure of a tyrannical popish government, unquote, proceeded to tyrannize the nonconformists and Catholics who were in the majority by establishing the Anglican Church and imposing a tax on all the inhabitants for its support. At this time, the communicants of the Church of England were a small minority in the colony. Under the guise of an act declared to be, quote, for the service of Almighty God, unquote, the Church of England was established in Maryland. The justices in each county were directed to lay out the county in parishes. The freeholders in each parish were to choose the vestry. Churches and chapels were ordered built, and a tax of 40 pounds of tobacco was laid on each taxable person for the support of the clergy. Now it says the Puritans, who had supported Coode and had at all times either openly or secretly opposed the rules and policies of the Lords Baltimore, now found themselves, quote, hoist by their own petard, unquote. Their clamor against the popish tyranny, the quote-unquote popish tyranny, which never existed, according to this author, now deprived them of the religious freedom they had previously enjoyed and for which they came to Maryland. They found themselves taxed to support a church to which they could not conform, but they meekly submitted, and there's no record of any protest being made by them. We'll continue with the reading of the Ark and the Dove and the End of the Catholic Rule by this Roman Catholic author. When we return from the break, you're listening to Inquisition Update. We'll be right back.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Now, returning to the book, The Ark and the Dove by J. Moss Ives, and we're talking about the establishment now of the Church of England in the colonies, and the situation that placed, the Puritans in a difficult situation. Remember, the Puritans hated the Catholic Church and the Church of England. First, they hated the Catholic Church for being that church of Antichrist. They understood the Scriptures. And they hated the Church of England because it acted so much like the Church of Rome. So the Puritans, when the Church of England was established in Maryland, it said they found themselves taxed to support a church to which they could not conform, that being the Church of England. But they meekly submitted, and there's no record of any protest made by them, according to this author. It says the only protest came from the Catholics and Quakers. The Quakers sent a deputation to England and also petitioned the Provincial Assembly for relief from church taxation as, quote, a burden to the consciences and estates, unquote. The framers of the Act of Church Establishment went back to the Title Code of 1639 for the phraseology of the law, but had substituted the Church of England for, quote, holy churches, unquote. Quoting further, it says, the Church of England within this province, unquote, reads the Act of 1692, shall have and enjoy all her rights, liberties, and franchises wholly inviolable, unquote. Similar phraseology was found in all the early acts of church liberties, but the departure comes from the Church of England. The departure comes when the Church of England is substituted for quote-unquote holy churches and quote-unquote holy church. So the language is a problem here. It says, again, going back to the Code of 1639, the Assembly was careful to insert a provision that the inhabitants of the colony should have all their rights and liberties under Magna Carta and the laws of England. Governor Nicholson informed the Assembly that King William desired to have no mention made of Magna Carta in the Act for church establishment and would not consent to any mention being made of civil liberties, for this would be joining ecclesiastical and temporal matters, in other words, union of church and state. He also informed them that it was the opinion of the Attorney General and the other learned lawyers in England that if the people of the colony were given the enjoyment of their rights under English law, they would have to try all their causes in Westminster Hall. The Assembly replied in a petition to the governor that in the case of the Great Charter, the liberties of both church and people were recognized in one grant, although in different paragraphs, and in Lord Baltimore's charter were to be found provisions both for liberties of the people and the propagation of the church. The Assembly questioned the opinion of the Attorney General and ordered that, quote, several lawyers in town, unquote, return at once a written opinion, quote, whether the insertion of the clause touching the liberty of the subjects does not thereby give right meum tuum to remove a cause to Westminster, and whether under Magna Carta a man cannot carry his cause to the Court of Common Pleas. 5 lawyers of the colony responded with a letter to the governor in which they were, quote, of humble opinion that the clause in question does not give it to any person to remove his cause to Westminster, unquote. There was the legal talent of St. Mary's arrayed against the Attorney General and other learned lawyers of England. All this reveals an anomalous situation. The Maryland legislators were quite willing to bring about church establishment and to abridge the liberties of all other churches, but they did insist on the recognition of the liberties of the people, and it says their insistence on the recognition of their rights under Magna Carta was undoubtedly the result of Catholic influence in the colony. The Act of Church Establishment was passed again by the Assembly, but with a clause inserted that, quote, His Majesty's subjects shall enjoy all their rights and liberties according to the laws and statutes of the Kingdom of England, unquote, leaving out any direct mention of the Magna Carta. Again, the royal displeasure was incurred and the act disallowed. For the first time in the history of Maryland, the King of England exercised a veto power on the acts of the Colonial Assembly, which never could have happened if the royal charter had been in force. After the Protestant Revolution, all acts were sent to England for the approval of the king, and Maryland became wholly subservient to the English crown and lost her independence. All of this was the most questionable validity, for the charter itself was never rightfully forfeited. Finally, in 1702, an act was passed receiving royal sanction which settled the church. Every inhabitant was required to pay a tax to support the clergy, and by the collection of fines under the act, church property was to be kept in repair. Under this law, the Church of England was established and remained the established Church of Maryland until the American Revolution. Sounds like a great motivation for the revolution, doesn't it, right here? The Church of England now is being established in the colonies. That puts Catholicism at an extreme disadvantage, unless, of course, they're going to use this establishment of the Church of England to foment a revolution from the English colony so that Catholicism can regain control in the colonies. You see, I've been taught all my life that the Revolutionary War was fought to separate the colonies from British control because of taxation without representation. That England was swallowing up all of the wealth of the colonies through taxation, and the colonies wanted their independence. What I'm beginning to learn now is that Rome wanted the colonies separated from Great Britain so that she could get control of the government and then use this country to fulfill Bible prophecy in bringing the rest of the world to the feet of the Pope. That's the only scenario that fits Bible prophecy. And so the American Revolution was fomented to separate the colonies from Great Britain to achieve irreversible control of the colonies by the Vatican. That's the new reality for me. Anyway, the book continues, quote, "Thus, says Cobb, did Maryland pass under bondage. The Puritan exchanged his liberty for a grudging and burdensome toleration, while the Romanist found himself locked out of his own home," unquote. Some measure of toleration was granted to Protestant dissenters, but this special grace was denied Catholics. Not only were they excluded from all participation in political privileges, both from voting and holding office, which had never been denied to Protestants when the Catholics were in power, but they were debarred from worshiping in their own churches. Not content to abridge the rights of Catholics in the exercise of their civil rights and the right to public worship, the lawmakers, emulating the example of their English progenitors, invaded the province of the home. Children of a marriage between a Catholic and a Protestant could be taken from either or both parents or from a widowed mother and placed where they might be, quote, securely educated in the Protestant religion, unquote. Now, this is the exact same behavior that Rome uses whenever she's in supreme power. And as the case with Tony Alamo Christian Ministries, we see Protestant children taken out from a Bible-believing ministry, from Bible-believing parents, and forced into this Roman Catholic system, education system, and Roman society that we live in. Because Tony Alamo's ministry for 40 years was warning God's people in this country about Roman control of the country. And they had to tear down that ministry. And they trumped up bogus charges against Tony Alamo, used the mainstream media, particularly in Arkansas, which is under the control of a Bohemian Grover, Walter E. Hussman Jr., and they destroyed Tony Alamo in the press. And then when it came time for the trial, conveniently his attorneys didn't seek a change of venue. And Arkansas got the conviction they wanted. The Roman Catholic Church got the conviction they wanted. And they got the kids, too. And they've let them all out for adoption. Put them in foster homes. Never to be returned to their parents. And that was the strategy Rome always used. Take the children, raise them up Catholics, and then make war upon the parents. War against the heretics. Burn their Bibles and burn those that read it. Now here we have an example, at least by this author, this Roman Catholic author, that now that the Church of England was established in the colonies, the Church of England used its prerogative to take control of the children, take them away from one or both parents, and put them in Protestant education, securing a religion for the children, and securing an education for the children in the Protestant religion. Anyway, it says, it was a strange picture and one not pleasant to behold. quote, in the land which Catholics had opened to Protestants, the Catholic inhabitant was the sole victim of Anglican intolerance, unquote. Presently, the old capital of St. Mary's was abandoned. The seat of government was removed to a new capital on the banks of the Severn, soon to be named Annapolis. This was to be expected. It was far too much to expect that the new regime would keep the capital of the colony in the center of Catholicism and named in honor of the Virgin Mary. The inhabitants of St. Mary's protested, and a petition was sent to the Assembly praying that the change be not made. The House of Burgesses returned an answer which has been described by John Fiske as brutal and vulgar. Perhaps it was just as well that the change was made. The soil of St. Mary's, hallowed by the planting of the first seeds of religious liberty in America, should not have been the seat of the government that was to follow. Just never forget that the situation we're in now is a direct antithesis to what this author is describing. They've corrupted the Protestants with this ecumenical movement. They've bound us with birth certificates and Social Security cards and Roman Catholic federal government benefits, and they've lured us to enslave ourselves. What we've done, although it was shrewd and clandestine, and we were uninformed that our government was Roman Catholic and that it was seeking to enslave us, nonetheless, we are enslaved by all these things that we call benefits. And we need to recognize that enslavement. And we need to understand to whom we are enslaved. And we need to repent. It's incredible, the metamorphosis, the change that has taken place in this country in a little over 225 years. But we're on the threshold, I believe, we're on the threshold of a complete destruction of the wall of separation between church and state and Catholicism, or quote-unquote Christianity, which basically means the same thing today, to become the state religion, and dissenters won't be tolerated. It's deja vu all over again. It's the dark days of the medieval ages when the Pope ruled supreme in Europe. Now he rules the world. And the United States, that lamb-like nation, learned how to speak like the dragon. Learned how to speak like Rome. Now we're going into the third section of this book, entitled The Harvest. We've prepared the soil, we've done the planting, and now the harvest, the last section of this book. And in chapter 1 of the third part of this book, it's entitled From Baltimore to Carroll, the Transition of Power. And this is the section of the book that should be most interesting to us and explain why it was that Pope Benedict XVI made sure that George W. Bush had a copy, or was it Pope John Paul II now that I recall, made sure that President George W. Bush had a copy of the autobiography of the Carroll family, John Carroll. And I'd love to have a copy of that book, too. If anybody can tell me where I can get a copy of the book that the Pope gave as a gift to President George W. Bush, I'd sure like to hear from you. Send me an email to inquisitionupdate@yahoo.com. I'd love to read that book. Again, my email address is inquisitionupdate@yahoo.com. Now, we'll just get started here before the end of the program, but we'll return to the subject Monday. We're making a transition from the government of the Lord's Baltimore to the Carroll family. And it says, during the first half century of its history, when there was no outside interference, colonial Maryland presents the fairest picture that can be found in any of the 13 colonies. After the Revolution of 1688, that's the Protestant Revolution, this picture would seem to have become entirely obliterated, leaving no trace of influence of the ideal that guided the founders. Therefore, most historians have looked upon the recognition of the principle of religious liberty in early Maryland as merely a passing phase with no lasting result, and as having no bearing whatever upon the founding of the Republic. Maryland was under the shadow of bigotry and intolerance from 1688 until the dawn of the national independence. Key phrase there. But it has been entirely overlooked that during these dark days there were watchmen on the towers of Israel. Dramatic language from this Catholic author. And it says, on the eve of the revolution that withdrew the Baltimore government, there came to Maryland the first Charles Carroll, graduate of the University of Douai in France, a student of the Inner Temple, and a member of the English bar. He received the appointment as Attorney General of the province from the 3rd Lord Baltimore. Now, this Inner Temple, I'm curious about this Inner Temple, and when I talk to John Daniel next time, I think I'm going to ask him. But this almost sounds like a Masonic order. He says, graduate of the University of Douai in France, which is a Catholic university, a student of the Inner Temple. I must know what that is. A student of the Inner Temple and a member of the English bar. He's an attorney. He received the appointment as Attorney General of the province from the 3rd Lord Baltimore. As to the real reason for his migration, his illustrious grandson, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, a century and a half later, wrote, quote, my grandfather, being a Roman Catholic by religion, resolved on withdrawing from the suppression of that period by emigrating to this country. He selected Maryland chiefly because toleration was by royal charter extended to it and afterwards confirmed by provincial statute. Upon leaving the mother country, he changed with a felicity of thought almost prophetic the motto of his family arms, in fide et in bello fortis, or tu ubicumque cum lubertat. My Latin is poor. Let me just continue. He'll give the translation here in a little bit. He changed the motto of his family coat of arms. And it says it was in allusion to the cause which induced him to leave the shores of his native land. The Revolution of 1688 in England was succeeded by a revolution in Maryland, and my grandfather was destined to experience, even in the asylum he had selected, the evils of that religious persecution from which he had so recently fled. So he came to the colony at the time of the Protestant Revolution and the establishment of the Church of England. In other words, he left the England because of the Catholic persecution in England, and came to the colonies to experience the transition to Protestant rule and suppression of Catholicism. I wouldn't say that he jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire, but he certainly didn't gain much. And that seems to be the thought of this quote. It says the change in the motto of the family coat of arms from, here's the translation, strong in faith and in war, to liberty in all things, was not almost prophetic. It was truly prophetic and is borne out by the life and services of the grandson who wrote the letter. Now, first, let's take a look at the original motto on Charles Carroll's coat of arms. Strong in faith and in war. Now, doesn't that describe the ancient Roman church? Strong in faith and in war. She is, after all, she calls herself the church militant. She calls herself the church militant. And then it was changed to liberty in all things. Of course, when you're Catholic and you have no liberty in Great Britain for the practice of your faith, all of a sudden liberty becomes all important. And what we're going to see in this country is liberty in all things for Catholics, and the imposition of war against God's people. Stay tuned for Nicholas Arthur's Cross the Border.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn. The Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the Scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.